Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my sensitive friend, and welcome to episode 123. Before we dive in, I want to quickly encourage you to hit subscribe if you haven't yet. That way, you won't have to think about, oh yeah, there's that podcast. Maybe there's a new episode, right? It'll just show up on your notifications or in your podcast app, and you'll never miss one. Such a simple and easy thing to do to progressively improve your relationship. All right, I'm excited for today's topic. It is 5 do's and don'ts for higher quality communication. This is really about creating a culture of good listening and open sharing. Right? Encouraging your partner to open up and also encouraging them to be a better listener. This is definitely an episode for your communication and connection toolkit. And on that note, if you haven't already grabbed it, you definitely want to get access to my free guide called The 7 Most Powerful Phrases to Deepen Connection in Your Marriage. It actually gives you 12 phrases that you can use in really specific situations to bring more connection in and various other things, all the good stuff between you and your partner. You can find that over at my website, www.lifeisworthloving.com. It'll be pretty obvious on the homepage where you can access that. And you can also just find the direct link in the show notes of this episode. So again, today is really about building more intimacy via communication. I do want to refer you back to a couple other episodes that are right in line with this one. So they're great episodes to kind of round this one out. The first one is how to create more emotional intimacy in your marriage. That's episode 81. And today's episode really builds on that one. And another great one is a recent episode called Deeper, More Meaningful Conversations with Your Spouse, which is episode 108. There are definitely more podcast episodes in this realm. And some fun news is that coming this summer, hopefully, is a podcast guide, meaning a guide or kind of a map to help you navigate this podcast, like which episodes will be the most useful for you, which are going to hit on topics that are close to your heart or that you know you could use some support around. So definitely keep your eyes and ears out for when that's available for you. Let's dive in, shall we? So I know that for so many of you, it's so important to feel heard by your significant other. I hear that all the time from my clients. I love that too. When my husband really hears me, I feel really heard. I feel seen. And I was actually just out for a little walk before recording this podcast, and I ran into my lovely neighbor, and she was just sharing a bit about challenges going on at work and how she was sharing the other day with her husband about one specific thing that felt a little bit like an injustice that had happened at work. And her husband finally really heard her, and it felt to her like this weight had lifted. So I think that's just such a beautiful thing about feeling heard. And like when our person really hears us, just to have someone understand and really get it and really hear what's going on for us can just feel really helpful, really powerful. And certainly feeling heard is a part of how we feel, close to and connected with our person. But the opposite is also true. It can be really frustrating and discouraging when your significant other isn't hearing you, or maybe even seems to not really even be trying to really hear you or understand you when you're sharing something vulnerable or important or close to your heart, or when you're trying to discuss an important issue, or even just sharing something light. you've probably heard me talk about how my husband, he does this thing when I'm talking sometimes where he's like, yeah. It's a clear sign he's not actually listening. And sometimes I'm not saying anything important, but even so, I don't particularly love that, right? Like when I'm talking, it'd be nice if he was listening and hearing me. So I've developed some strategies around this with my husband, and today I'm going to share some of them because I really want you to feel heard, and you really do have huge sway over how much listening and hearing and even, open sharing is done in your relationship. Unsurprisingly, though, as much as we may want to feel really heard and have there be a great culture of listening and openly sharing in our relationships, we don't always create the best conditions for it. Sometimes, if you're honest with yourself, if you're like most women, you're probably trying to get that great listening from your partner without always offering it to your partner. It may not be the case for you, but it often is. And a really huge kind of untapped power of influence that we have as women in our relationships is to model how we want to be treated. You've heard me talk about this a lot in the podcast, and that's because it's so true. We really can't expect others to be great at treating us how we want to be treated if we are unwilling to give that ourselves. I mean, we can expect it. I know I sure have plenty. I expected such things without doing it myself, but it usually doesn't pan out so well over the long term in our relationships. So listening effectively is a huge piece of being heard by your partner. Because as you get good at listening effectively, you're going to actually help shape the listening and hearing culture, right? The communication culture in your marriage into one that naturally leads to more intimacy and closeness. So this doesn't mean you won't have time to share and be heard. You're going to be able to have time for sharing, especially if you model it and also perhaps ask for it, which is a topic for another podcast episode. But your first move is to lead the way in how good listening is done, right? If you want your partner to listen really well, then lead the way and you start by listening really well, right? You model it. And over time, your partner catches on. And I have to say, it also feels really good to be a good listener. One of the most important things in our intimate relationships is to feel good about how we are showing up. And you kind of taking the leadership role in listening well, one of the other cool things about that is not only does it lead to more of you being heard over time, but it also tends to encourage more sharing from your partner's end, right? Because he feels heard, he feels valued and safe with you when you're a good listener. So this is a seriously good benefit for highly sensitive women, right? As we tend to love that kind of connection that comes through these open sharing conversations. And I've just heard so many of my clients express how much they want their partner to open up more and share more of what's close to his heart. So being a really good listener is such a beautiful way to encourage more of that from him. So let's talk about 5 things you may be doing that are discouraging your partner from opening up and from listening well so that you can feel heard. And then we'll talk about what to do instead that will encourage his good listening and his open sharing. We could, think of these as the do's and the don'ts of encouraging more great listening and great open sharing. And what I'm going to share here really applies to the little moments of communication throughout your daily lives together, right? Like the good mornings, the times you're just talking about a tiny little thing here and there. and the harder discussions or bigger topics you talk about as well. And both of those are equally important in your relationship. Like those little moments of communicating that like pepper your days together really are a huge part of what make your relationship good or less good. So take these do's and don'ts to heart in general for all communication with your partner. So let's dive in. We're going to start with the first thing that discourages him from good listening, really hearing you, and opening up. And that is not telling your partner when you're unable to listen well, right? Like my husband going, yeah, comes to mind, right? Like if you're distracted or you're not in like emotional states that are conducive to being present with him and really listening, if you're not telling him, hey, I can't listen right now, or let's talk about this a little later, that's actually going to discourage a great culture of hearing and sharing with each other. And you could think about why by thinking about times when your partner has acted like he was listening, but you could feel he wasn't, right? Like maybe he's looking at his phone and you're sharing something, or he's, obviously engaged in something else and you're trying to talk with him about something. And you could feel that disinterest, right? Or maybe you even feel hurt. So if you had too much of that happening, that would probably make you not want to share so much, right? Because what's the point? They're not even listening, right? So if you reverse roles, it probably feels very similar to him and isn't likely to encourage him to want to be a great listener to you or to share with you. So what do you do instead of kind of trying to listen when actually you can't fully, in order to encourage his good listening and open sharing? You just tell him. You just say, hey, right now I can't actually be fully present. I can't listen fully right now. You're welcome to share why, but you don't have to. And then you can communicate that you do want to hear what he's saying, that it matters to you to hear what he's sharing. But you're going to need to do it when you can really focus and feel able to be present. As much as this might feel slightly uncomfortable for some of you, it's being really honest. And especially if you do actually make time to listen later, like you honor your word about finding time later, it's really just going to build trust and respect between you. All right, let's dive into the second thing that discourages him from being a great listener himself or openly sharing. And that is interrupting. If you interrupt when your person is sharing, it makes it difficult to share. And it's a sign that you're more invested in being heard than hearing your partner, than listening truly. If your partner tends to interrupt you, it can be easy to kind of follow suit yourself. But then that's kind of letting his way of communicating be the leader of your communication culture in your relationship. So not recommended. And what's interesting, I think, about interrupting, and I find that this is what's going on for me when I find myself every once in a while interrupting, is that I'm so much in my thoughts, right? In my own thoughts and my own internal processing around what's being said and my thought tangents that I'm not truly listening, right? I'm focused on sharing what I'm thinking, right? Which is really not true listening. So look out for that in yourself. And obviously interrupting is just kind of disrespectful. So what do you do instead to encourage good listening and open sharing on your partner's end? Here's what you do. When you are entering any conversation, set the intention or intend to listen more than to be heard. At least when your partner is actually speaking, Like, it's fine to go into a conversation being like, hey, I have something I want to talk about, honey. And you do the bulk of the talking. But when it's your partner's turn to share, make sure you're intending in those moments to listen rather than to be heard. And really listen then fully with no concern for your own response at the moment. Like, you're going to have time to formulate a response, but while they're actually speaking, don't worry about that. What can be helpful for formulating your own response is giving yourself permission to pause after your partner's finished sharing, right? So that you can gather your thoughts. And, for that, you can even say, let me just think about this. Let me just think for a moment how I'd like to respond. And if your partner starts talking right again before you've had a chance to respond, you can always be like, hey, do you mind just giving me a moment? I do have some things I want to share in response to what you said, but I just need a moment to think. I think some of what I'm going to share in the other tips will also help with this. So the third thing that discourages your partner from open sharing and really hearing you is you quickly reacting with defensiveness or with a need to be right. Don't be too quick to react intensely. And kind of what I mean by that is express judgment, get defensive, prove he's wrong. When this is done habitually, it will really close that other person down, making them less likely to want to share with you much of anything, because the conversations just aren't fun or even productive. So my husband, as you may have heard before on this podcast, has historically, although he's getting a lot better, done the defensive thing a lot. And it's really like when he does it, it can feel like he's closing a door to what I was trying to get at. And he ends up kind of missing the point. And sometimes I don't feel naturally like continuing, because it just feels difficult, like I'm not being met with any receptivity. So, that defensiveness, those quick reactions that need to be right or prove them wrong. It's also, often a sign that we really aren't fully listening, but rather are jumping to conclusions or making assumptions or taking things personally before we even really understand our significant other's full share. And if you find yourself kind of having that urge to be right or make him wrong, well, it's kind of common for us as humans, right? But that's really just great fuel for arguments and misunderstanding and no one listening or sharing openly. And I do have a whole podcast on being right versus being married. It's kind of in the early era of the podcast. It's a great one to have a listen to if you find yourself kind of needing to be right or having that urge to make your partner wrong and make yourself right. So definitely check that one out. So what do you do instead to encourage good listening and open sharing? So I really do want to acknowledge that it can be hard to not get reactive, to not get defensive or react with harshness or offense when our partner is, especially when they're being critical or seeming to blame you for something. But again, that's only going to fuel more harsh stuff between you and less respect and good listening and communication. And, I certainly do know the sort of egoic satisfaction of being right and proving someone wrong, right? But it's ultimately not a real win. So instead of defending or making our person wrong, be willing to listen to understand. So this really means being present with what your partner's sharing and going through, and focusing on what's going on for them rather than how what they're saying affects you at the moment, right? So it's a subtle shift of attention here. being interested in what's really going on for your partner, what they're feeling and thinking, instead of getting caught up in what's going on for you at the moment. This doesn't mean neglect yourself. It really just means being curious and being interested and even seeing things from your partner's perspective for a little while. And of course, if it's being delivered, if his words are being delivered, if what he's trying to say is being delivered in a less than kind way, looking below the surface of his harshness, of his like kind of harsh delivery can be helpful. And you can do that by asking yourself, where might he be hurting? Or how might he be hurting that he's speaking this way to me? Which really is about getting curious about what's going on for them. This, of course, can be difficult when you're prone to taking things personally, which is why I'm creating a whole course that everyone can have access to on how to stop taking things so personally, which you can look forward to sometime later this summer. So keep your eyes out for that. It's been such a powerful course for people who've done it. It used to be in the form of a challenge. It's going to be a course from now on. Another tip for not reacting quickly or falling into that defensive mode or needing to be right mode is a really interesting one. It's allowing your feelings to just be there, right? You might have the urge to defend. You might have some protective feelings come up, and so you're going to want to defend, or you might feel like proving him wrong or judging him. But a really powerful move is to be able to just allow the feelings that are coming up to be there, and instead of reacting out of them, turn your attention to, again, what's going on for your partner. Like, just because we have challenging feelings arise, it doesn't mean we instantly have to address them and act out of them and speak out of them. And yes, this can take some work. This can take some skill development. And certainly, if your partner is being kind of harsh, or he's using an intense tone, or he is actually criticizing, you can say something along these lines, which I've used in the past to great success. You can say to your partner, when you say it like that, or in that tone, it's really hard for me to hear. Could you please say it in a kinder way so that I can really understand what you're trying to say? I think this is a really important kind of sentence to have on hand as a highly sensitive person, because we are so aware of subtle tone, and we can have this tendency to take things personally and feel hurt easily, which actually shuts down our capacity to truly hear our partner. So communicating that can actually help him start speaking a little bit more gently, making it possible for you to really do these other things that I've been saying better, to really hear him. The next couple tips for the next two do's and don'ts are also really going to be helpful for this one. So the fourth thing that discourages your partner from opening up and hearing you is not asking questions. This is just kind of a fun one. Like, we tend to just miss the opportunity, if we're not asking questions, to kind of open the door to more understanding and inviting him to open up even more, right? So not asking questions isn't bad. It's just a lost opportunity for more connection and understanding. So what do you do instead to encourage your partner's good listening and open sharing? You get curious and you ask questions. As I mentioned before, there's a podcast called Deeper, More Meaningful Conversations with Your Spouse. In that, I give you lots of questions you can ask to have deeper, interesting conversations. And I talk about how the key to good question asking is asking open-ended questions, right? But when you're listening to really hear your partner, to understand what they're saying, and therefore encourage more of that from his end as well, the best fuel for asking good questions is simply being curious about your partner, their opinion, their challenges, whatever it is they're talking about. So in the simplest sense, if you just listen with a sense of being curious, rather than just trying to be right or make your own point, you're naturally going to find places you just want to know more, which is when you can ask a question about that thing you want to know more about. So there's not necessarily right and wrong questions. It's just as long as you're curious about your partner, you're interested, you're going to find places where questions are really appropriate. Preferably open-ended questions, as that will draw out more of what they're trying to say versus a yes or no question. And, if you find that you aren't naturally gifted at coming up with questions, that's fine. I don't think I used to be either. It can help to just simply say, hey, can you say more about XYZ? Or could you help me understand what you mean when you say XYZ? That's a great way to encourage more of his sharing and to really listen and to really understand what's being said. In other words, listen to really hear your partner. And this is also a great thing to do instead of getting defensive, is to ask great questions. So the fifth thing, the final thing for today that discourages our person from openly sharing or really being willing to hear us is not empathizing or affirming or showing understanding when they're talking. This one can oftentimes go hand in hand with the defensive and reacting one. I'm sure that you've been on the receiving end of this, probably from your partner, certainly from various people in your life. And that just feels weird and not so safe, especially when you're sharing something vulnerable and you're not being met with understanding, with empathy. So just like it would for you, it can easily lead to your partner not wanting to open up or elaborate any further about something. So this is, again, why we don't jump into defending or even fixing or advice giving right away, which is not something I talked about today. We're not going to be covering that, but think about it as a bonus to not jump straight to, which is fixing or advice giving. So what do you do to encourage good listening and open sharing? You empathize, you affirm them, you show them that you're understanding. And you can do that all sorts of ways. You're probably actually fairly natural at this as a highly sensitive woman. But some specific ways things you can do or say, I get that. That must feel hard. Or, I can see how you could see it that way. Or, I understand why you feel that way now. Or, I get how you could be thinking about it like that. This can really tend to help them open up and share even more because it helps them feel comforted and supported and safe. So all the do's that I have just shared likely models the way you likely want your partner to listen and engage in communication with you. Yes? I bet you'd love for him to be curious and interested and ask you questions and not react quickly and make time to listen and tell you when he can't really listen, when he's not able to fully focus, but that he wants to carve out some time for that soon. And when he does, be fully present with you and really listen to really understand instead of being caught up in what he wants to say and not interrupt, and to empathize and affirm what you're sharing. Yeah, I know. I want that from my husband. And I get it a lot more than I used to because I've both modeled a lot of that and I've made requests. So go out there and try out these 5 do's and don'ts. Lead the way, model this. And even if you just try 1 or 2 at first, that's a great start. And as I'm always saying, as you start doing things differently, it's not necessarily going to be an instant mirroring that happens. Like your partner's not necessarily going to be instantly doing the same thing. It can take some patience and some persistence. But if you keep at it and you live out these 5 do's and don'ts, you are truly going to be seeing huge positive changes in that culture of listening and sharing between you and your partner. And again, if you want some specific things you can say for specific situations that will increase connection, build trust, and just generally help your relationship thrive as a sensitive person, definitely, if you haven't grabbed it yet, grab my 7 most powerful phrases to deepen connection. The direct link is in the show notes, or you can head over to www.lifeisworthloving.com and you'll find a place there to grab it. Here's to great high quality communication and deepening intimacy in your relationship. And be oh so well, my friend.